I never imagined a parking issue would unravel an entire criminal scheme behind a suburban HOA. But that's exactly what happened after I discovered an unlabeled flash drive lying in my garage. One that must have fallen from the pocket of Veronica Marshall, the HOA president who had unlawfully parked two massive black Raptors in my space. At the time, I thought it was just another case of entitled behavior. I had no clue it would lead me straight into a tangle of shady wire transfers, offshore shell companies, and something ominously labeled Project Phoenix. The deeper I looked, the more apparent it became. Veronica wasn't just an overbearing HOA president. She was laundering money under the noses of an unsuspecting neighborhood. She was about to learn that not every line you cross stays local. Some lead straight to federal courtrooms. At 42, I was a freelance graphic designer starting fresh in Green Valley, a quiet suburb far from city chaos. I'd bought my dream home specifically outside the reach of the Golden Hills Estates HOA. I valued privacy, especially after a divorce and a career reset. Life was peaceful, until the neighborhood barbecue. That's when I met Veronica Marshall. Her cold smile came with an unsettling comment. My home had been mistakenly left out of the HOA, but they'd be fixing that soon. Weeks later, I came back from the store to find my garage door ajar, and inside were two massive black Ford Raptors. My Honda Civic had been shoved onto the driveway. Horrified, I checked the footage. Veronica had used a remote to open my garage and directed the trucks in herself. The drivers? Two unknown men who left with her. Furious, I went straight to the HOA office. Veronica greeted me with a sarcastic, "Oh, it's you!" and gestured vaguely toward a chair. I demanded answers. Why were strangers' trucks in my garage, and why had my car been displaced? She brushed it off, claiming it was due to the upcoming Rose Festival. The trucks, she said, belonged to important guests, and the board had decided to move large vehicles off the official festival route. My home, being less central and modest, had been selected to host them. Then came the insult. I should feel honored. According to her, the prestige of Golden Hills benefited even homes like mine, despite being outside their jurisdiction. I told Veronica that my house wasn't part of the HOA and showed her proof. She brushed it off, calling it a bureaucratic error, and claimed their legal team was already working to correct it by incorporating properties like mine. She even pointed to a folder she said contained draft paperwork. I didn't care. I just demanded the keys or contact info for the truck owners. I wanted them gone. Veronica smirked and refused. She said the Raptors were part of a paid premium HOA parking service for the festival and would remain in my garage until it ended. The owners, she added, had been told the garage was secured with permission. Then, in a final insult, she handed me a business card reading Golden Hills Estates Parking Service, stood up, and told me this arrangement was beneficial to everyone. As she escorted me toward the exit, her tone dropped. She leaned in slightly, gave my arm a patronizing pat, and said that, just between us, I should really do something about the low bushes in my front yard, that they needed trimming to meet the approved guidelines. Apparently, a neighbor named Mrs. Henderson had already voiced her disapproval. Before I could respond, before the rage boiling inside me could even rise to the surface, the door clicked shut in my face. I stood there on the HOA's front steps, furious, humiliated, and with a growing sense that I'd just been drawn into something far more hostile than I had anticipated. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a direct challenge. When I got home, I immediately called the police. I felt sick. Not just angry, but genuinely unsettled. Maybe they could step in and put an end to this madness quickly. Officer Miller arrived within the hour, wearing the world-weary expression of someone who'd seen this sort of mess before. I laid everything out for him, showed him the footage, pointed out Veronica in the video, and explained the situation in detail. He sighed and admitted he understood my frustration. But then came the bad news. Since there was a dispute over the property lines and Veronica claimed HOA authority, it wasn't considered criminal trespassing. Not yet. Unless the trucks were stolen or clear damage occurred, this was a civil matter, not one the police could handle. He advised me to document everything, take photos, consult a lawyer, and request a land record confirmation from the city. Before leaving, he added that Golden Hills had a reputation. This wasn't their first boundary dispute. His words didn't make me feel any better. I'd been hoping for action, not advice. But now I knew I was in this fight alone, at least for the time being. It became clear that I couldn't count on the police to resolve this quickly. So my next logical move was to get the trucks towed. But even that path was blocked. I contacted multiple towing companies, only to be met with polite refusals. Once I gave them the address and mentioned Golden Hills, their tone changed. Some claimed they were fully booked. One dispatcher even paused and asked if this was that place, the one Veronica Marshall had apparently flagged, warning them about an unstable resident trying to remove vehicles from official HOA parking areas. It hit me then. She had already gotten ahead of me. She'd spun the narrative, blacklisted me, and made sure no one would help. I felt cornered. With towing services out of the question and no help from law enforcement, I decided I had to take matters into my own hands. The only clue I had were the personalized plates on the Raptors. One read Big Boss, the other RPT Man. It wasn't much, but it was something. I started doing online searches, made a few strategic phone calls, and eventually traced one of the SUVs to a high-end hotel in town, the Willow Creek Inn. A quick inquiry there led me to Mr. Harrison, the owner of the truck with the Big Boss plate. He sounded stunned when I explained what had happened. Embarrassed, even. He told me they had paid a hefty fee to the Golden Hills HOA for what Veronica had described as exclusive, secure parking. She had given them personal assurances that their vehicles would be kept safe. But he had no idea she'd stashed them in someone else's private garage without permission. Mr. Harrison apologized repeatedly and said his team would retrieve the cars immediately. True to his word, within the hour, both Raptors were gone. I finally had my garage back, but it didn't feel like a victory. I couldn't shake the unease, the intrusion, the sense that my space had been violated in a way that ran deeper than just property lines. Then came the next blow. The very next morning, as if she wanted to make a statement, I found a thick, official-looking envelope in my mailbox from Golden Hills Estates. It was labeled Welcome Packet. Inside, I found page after page of rules, an inspection calendar, a long list of penalties for every minor infraction, and a bill, yes, a bill, for the first month's HOA dues. But what chilled me most was the enclosed neighborhood map. Someone had highlighted my property in bright yellow, clearly marking it as part of the HOA. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a lie. One that contradicted every document I'd reviewed before purchasing my home. That evening, I decided to pay a visit to Gary, my neighbor next door. He was one of the more grounded people I'd met in the area, and I was hoping for some insight, or at least some validation that I wasn't losing my mind. When I told him about the Raptors and the surprise welcome packet, he just shook his head with a grim expression. "You stirred up the nest," he said. "Big time." Gary told me this wasn't Veronica's first stunt. He called her a mini tyrant who'd long used a tactic he dubbed border expansion, quietly absorbing homes outside HOA limits by harassing owners with fake fines and relentless pressure. The previous owners of my house? They'd left in part due to her bullying. When I asked why no one stopped her, Gary was blunt. Her husband, Richard, was a powerful attorney with strong city ties. Veronica, meanwhile, had convinced many that her strict rule boosted property values. People either feared her, profited from her, or stayed silent. Just then, a car pulled up. Pam, Veronica's cold, loyal assistant, got out, took photos of my house, taped a document to my door, and left without a word. I peeled the paper off and read it. It was yet another official violation notice, this time citing me for an improperly displayed address number. Apparently, the font, size, and material didn't comply with the Golden Hills Estates aesthetic standards. Along with the notice came a $75 fine. My jaw clenched. This wasn't a coincidence or some mix-up. It was a calculated escalation. They were coming after me piece by piece. I couldn't sleep that night. At my computer, I started digging, and what I found floored me. Veronica Marshall was running for city council. Her campaign site was glossy and full of staged community bliss. My house was right there, used without permission under a caption praising elevated standards. Worse, her real estate listings showed homes near mine, outside the original HOA zone, now advertised as part of elite Golden Hills, with inflated prices. It all clicked. This wasn't just power tripping. Veronica was turning control into a product. using homes like mine to sell status, raise property values, and polish her political image. My property had become part of her real estate and campaign machine. And then I thought back to the Raptors. The whole premium parking story never made sense. The secrecy, the awkward parking, Mr. Harrison's sudden urgency to remove the trucks. Something felt wrong from the start. If it was just for show, why hide the Raptors in my garage? I hadn't dared to check inside them, but now I regretted it. After Gary's warning and what I'd just uncovered, my unease turned to deep suspicion. What if those trucks weren't just parked? What if they were hiding something? Then I remembered. After the Raptors were removed, while pacing in frustration, I spotted something small on the garage floor near where one had been. A black flash drive, unlabeled. At the time, I'd stuffed it in my pocket and forgotten about it. But now, it felt like a possible key to everything. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop. No password. Just a folder named Project_Phoenix. Inside were spreadsheets with cryptic figures, PDFs resembling blueprints, and a text file listing GPS coordinates. It made no sense, but I knew it wasn't festival-related. I backed everything up and hid the drive. Meanwhile, Veronica retaliated. Days after I contacted the SUV owners, a building inspector showed up. Mr. Rodriguez claimed there was an anonymous report of unpermitted renovations. I didn't need to guess who had filed it. Still, I kept my cool. I invited Mr. Rodriguez in, showed him my yard, my garage, my house, every corner. I even pulled out the documentation from my purchase, renovation records, everything. He was thorough. I'll give him that. He inspected everything carefully, asked a few questions, took a few notes, but in the end, his verdict was clear. There were no violations, no unpermitted work, and nothing remotely out of order. I casually brought up the ongoing issues I'd been having with the HOA, more specifically with Veronica. Mr. Rodriguez just gave a subtle nod, as if this wasn't news to him. He said that, yes, he'd heard similar complaints before, and he confirmed something important. Based on the city's zoning records, my property was definitively not within Golden Hills Estate's jurisdiction. Their rules had no legal bearing on me. It was only a small victory, but it was the first official one, and it gave me a sliver of leverage in a battle that was clearly far from over. But Veronica wasn't done. When official tactics failed, she got personal. The next day, I spotted two landscapers outside, strangers tearing up the fruit trees I'd planted after my divorce. They weren't just plants. They represented peace and new beginnings. I rushed out, furious. One of the workers calmly showed me a removal order, signed by Veronica, citing aesthetic violations and pest concerns. It was pure HOA fiction, another power move. I pointed angrily to the bold signs I had installed on my lawn. Private property, not part of HOA. I made it clear that their order held no authority here. The foreman looked genuinely confused and concerned. He didn't argue. Instead, he stepped aside and called his dispatcher, clearly reluctant to get caught in a legal dispute. Not even 5 minutes later, I heard the crunch of tires in the gravel. Veronica's signature white Range Rover rolled to a stop in front of my house. She stepped out with the same frosty expression I'd come to expect, collected, smug, and unbothered. She walked over as if this was a minor inconvenience and greeted me with a voice laced in false sweetness. "It seems we've run into another little misunderstanding," she said. She gestured toward the trees, claiming I'd already been informed they were against the HOA's landscaping code. Too messy, too insect-prone, and too out of sync with the refined image their community strived for. I didn't hold back. My voice rose. I reminded her again that I was not, and never had been, a part of her HOA. I pointed to my signs. I reminded her she was trespassing and acting outside any legitimate authority. Veronica let out a theatrical sigh and removed her designer sunglasses. Her eyes locked onto mine with icy precision. She didn't flinch. Instead, she said my signs were themselves a violation. Unsightly, in her words. She told me my continued defiance was becoming a serious problem for the community. According to her, multiple homeowners had been calling daily to complain about the visual damage my property was supposedly causing. It was clear now. This wasn't just about trees. This was personal. She was sending a message, and I had no doubt more was coming. I pulled out my phone and began recording, making sure Veronica saw the camera aimed right at her. With a firm voice, I stated, for the record, that her presence, as well as the actions of the landscaping crew she'd brought, amounted to trespassing and property damage. I made it crystal clear. If they didn't leave immediately, I'd be calling the police and filing a formal claim for compensation. Then I planted myself between the workers and the remaining trees. 2 had already been ripped out of the ground. 3 still stood, and I wasn't letting them touch another one. For just a moment, I saw something flicker across Veronica's face. A raw flash of rage that broke through her cold exterior. But just as fast, she pulled herself back together. Her voice dropped low, sharp as a blade. "You're making a serious mistake," she said through clenched teeth. "Our community has its ways of dealing with residents who refuse to cooperate." The air around us hung heavy with tension. Then, after a long pause, she gave the foreman a small nod and muttered that they could stop for now. "That's enough for today," she said. As the workers packed up, she turned to me with one final scowl and added, "But don't fool yourself. This isn't finished. Your property will be brought in line, whether you like it or not. The board has already approved the next steps." With that, she spun around, climbed into her Range Rover, and drove away without another word. I knelt in front of the broken roots of what used to be a young apple tree, my hands in the dirt. This was my home, my sanctuary, and she had violated it like it was hers to control. My dream was being dismantled, one hostile act at a time. But this time I wasn't going to sit back and wait. I pulled out my phone again, but not to record. This time I made 2 calls. First, I dialed Claire Branson, a lawyer I'd been recommended a while ago but hadn't yet contacted. Then I rang Officer Miller. But it was Claire who would become the turning point. From the moment I met her, I knew Claire was exactly the person I needed on my side. Sharp, quick-witted, and laser-focused, she listened to my chaotic story without interruption, absorbing every detail. She asked the kind of thoughtful questions that helped me make better sense of my own timeline. And when I cautiously brought up the flash drive, half expecting her to laugh it off or dismiss me as paranoid, something sparked in her eyes. Her interest became immediate and intense, the kind of gleam you see in someone who just stumbled onto something big. Without hesitation, she said we needed to go through it, together. Her voice carried a mix of excitement and professional instinct. It might be nothing, she said, or it might be the thread that unravels the whole sweater. For the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel alone. I had backup, real, capable backup. Over the following evenings, Claire and I threw ourselves into what became a series of high-intensity strategy sessions. Sometimes we met at my place, spreading papers across my kitchen table, the air thick with the smell of strong coffee and ink from the overworked printer. Other times we camped out in her compact but inviting home office, surrounded by legal books and the soft hum of her desktop computer. Every evening blurred into the next as we pored over the files from that mysterious Project_Phoenix folder. Claire was brilliant, and not just in the courtroom sense. She had a sharp legal mind, yes, but also a surprising talent with tech. She was able to dissect the file structure quickly and even bypass some rudimentary security protocols embedded in the spreadsheets. What we uncovered was staggering. Those Excel documents weren't just filled with random numbers. They were coded financial ledgers, encrypted trails of money bouncing between offshore accounts in a pattern only someone with serious intent to cover their tracks would use. The funds were moving across banks in Panama, the Caymans, and other secrecy-friendly havens. None of the company names were real. They were masked by aliases, and none of the names attached to transactions were full names either. But the numbers, the sheer amounts involved, were breathtaking. These weren't neighborhood budgets. These were 7- and 8-figure transfers, the kind of movement usually reserved for shadow corporations and international fraud cases. I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that this was all linked to our quiet suburban community. Then came the PDFs. Far from being abstract diagrams, they revealed detailed architectural plans, maps for planned developments, commercial construction zones, utility grids, and subdivisions. When we laid them side by side with zoning maps of Green Valley, things started falling into place, disturbingly so. The sites Veronica had been targeting through her boundary expansions matched up precisely with several of the plots outlined in these files. including, I noticed with a cold knot in my chest, a parcel of land directly bordering my backyard. One of the most elaborate documents named the company behind these acquisitions, Phoenix Development Group. It didn't take long to trace it, registered in the Cayman Islands, naturally. But what hit hardest was the U.S. Contact listed for the company, Marshall and Associates. That was Richard Marshall's firm, Veronica's husband. The man who until now had remained a shadow behind her actions was suddenly revealed to be a major player. And then we opened the text file with the GPS coordinates. They led to a series of strange, out-of-the-way sites across the county, old warehouses, unused lots, even a boarded-up marina. But one location made us both freeze. It pointed directly to a decaying, long-forgotten picnic pavilion on the actual grounds of Golden Hills Estates. Residents strolled past it daily, unaware that something deeper, perhaps much darker, might be buried right beneath their feet. Claire leaned back in her chair, her brows furrowed, lips pressed tightly. We stared at the screen in silence. The pieces were fitting together in a way that felt less like a mystery and more like a warning. This wasn't about a garage or fruit trees anymore. We were staring into the heart of something far more dangerous than an HOA turf war. Claire leaned back in her chair, her expression now heavy with thought. For a few long seconds, she sat in silence, processing everything we had uncovered. Then, with a calm and measured tone, she shared her conclusion. And it changed everything. According to her, what happened in my garage, the unauthorized use of my space and those suspicious raptors, wasn't the story. It was barely the opening chapter. In her professional opinion, backed by everything we had pieced together so far, the whole spectacle of the annual Rose Festival, the glitzy charity events, and Veronica's carefully curated public persona were nothing more than smoke and mirrors, a sophisticated distraction. Claire believed, and I agreed, that the Golden Hills Estates HOA had become a perfect front. On the surface, it looked like a well-run, if overly strict, neighborhood organization. But behind that polished image, it was being used as a staging ground. A cover for far more serious operations involving land acquisition, real estate manipulation, and massive financial flows likely tied to money laundering. And right at the center of that web, Richard Marshall, the high-powered attorney who wasn't just enabling these operations with legal shields, but potentially orchestrating them through his firm's network and influence. Her words chilled me. What I had taken as personal harassment, the parking violations, the fines, the boundary disputes, now appeared as deliberate tactics in a much larger chess game. The goal wasn't just control, it was conquest. Every so-called annexation Veronica pursued, including the blatant push against my property, seemed to be part of a methodical strategy, acquiring key real estate along the edge of the HOA for a purpose hidden behind the name Project_Phoenix. It wasn't about appearances anymore. It wasn't even about community politics. We were staring at a coordinated operation, one that cloaked itself in neighborhood bylaws and HOA meetings while playing with serious financial fire behind the scenes. And suddenly, everything made sense. The forged maps, the intimidation, the falsified welcome packets. They weren't random power grabs. They were components of a calculated plan to seize control over strategic land. My land included. This wasn't just a personal fight anymore. It was the beginning of something far bigger and far more dangerous. With this new and disturbing truth in hand, Claire and I both understood the stakes had risen dramatically. We couldn't afford recklessness. Every move from here on had to be calculated, slow, steady, and precise. Claire, leveraging her legal background and professional authority, wasted no time. She began drafting and submitting official information requests to a host of municipal and regional departments, the city archive, the county land registry, and the local tax offices. Her goal was to uncover any traceable records connected to Marshall and Associates, especially any transactions or developments linked to the plots listed in the Project_Phoenix documents. She also cast a wide net, looking for names, contractors, or companies that might have been buried in fine print but connected to the Marshall's scheme. Every paper trail was a potential breakthrough. While Claire handled the legal and bureaucratic front, I took on a more subtle role. I started quietly asking around, feeling out people in the neighborhood without setting off alarms. I began with those living in the HOA's outer fringe, like myself, owners of border properties. But I also approached a few residents firmly inside Golden Hills who, rumor had it, weren't exactly fans of Veronica's rule. That's when Gary, my reliable next-door neighbor, really stepped up. He had already been a source of sanity through all of this, but now he became something more, a genuine partner. When I told him what Claire and I had uncovered, he didn't flinch or question it. He simply nodded with that grim, knowing look and said he'd always had a bad feeling about the Marshalls, that their carefully curated image never sat right with him. Then Gary shared something unexpected and potentially invaluable. Gary had installed a discreet camera facing the HOA clubhouse after noticing Veronica hosting private parties for wealthy associates. She used HOA electricity, equipment, and space without permission or reimbursement, treating it all like her own. Gary offered to let me review the footage from the past couple of months. Maybe, he said, there'd be something in there we could use, something to support the broader case Claire and I were building. I didn't know it yet, but that quiet little camera would soon provide us with another crucial piece of the puzzle. And as it turned out, Gary's instincts had been spot on. After carefully reviewing hours of footage from his hidden security camera, we uncovered a subtle but telling piece of visual proof, one that added another crack in the Marshal's carefully constructed image. On several different nights, the video clearly showed a long orange extension cord snaking across the lawn, plugged directly into the HOA clubhouse's main power source and running all the way to the Marshal's property next door. That single cable powered far more than just decorative lights. It kept the lavish outdoor lighting aglow during Veronica's exclusive evening gatherings, and more notably, sustained a small greenhouse tucked behind their home, the one where, according to neighborhood chatter, Veronica nurtured her award-winning orchids like royalty. By itself, it may have seemed minor compared to offshore accounts and rigged land deals. But this was different. It was undeniable, concrete video evidence of theft of HOA utilities for personal luxury. Another piece of the puzzle. Another example of how deeply Veronica and Richard had embedded themselves into the system they were draining. Little by little, as Claire and I began to quietly share information with a select few people we knew we could trust, the walls began to crack from within. Several Golden Hills residents who had long felt uneasy under Veronica's authoritarian leadership started reaching out to us. Some shared their doubts in hushed tones. Others went a step further. Anonymous packages began appearing. Envelopes slid into our mailboxes containing copies of old HOA meeting records. They confirmed what we had only suspected until then. There had been questions. The previous treasurer, Eleanor Weinberg, had clearly tried to raise concerns about vague expenses and unexplained allocations. Her inquiries were either brushed aside or drowned out by rapid-fire votes pushed through by Veronica, especially concerning large sums marked for community improvements or oddly worded consulting services. And when we followed the paper trail, one name kept popping up behind those contracts, Richard Marshall or one of his associates. Meanwhile, emboldened by the fact that someone was finally standing up, several property owners on the neighborhood's edge, people like me who had previously stayed silent out of fear, now came forward. They handed over written statements, emails, letters, copies of fines, all evidence of the pressure, threats, and outright manipulation they had endured at Veronica's hands. Piece by piece, the image of a benevolent HOA president was crumbling, replaced by something far more calculated and far more corrupt. One of the most unexpected and invaluable allies to join our cause turned out to be Eleanor Weinberg, the former HOA treasurer herself. Though elderly, she was sharp, fiery, and full of determination. A retired accountant with decades of experience, Eleanor carried herself with quiet authority, and she had a story to tell. She explained that 2 years earlier, she had effectively been pushed out of her volunteer role on the board. Why? Because she had dared to ask too many questions, especially about the opaque financial flows surrounding the annual Rose Festival and a growing list of special initiatives spearheaded by Veronica. According to Eleanor, those projects operated under a separate internal committee, one that unsurprisingly included only Veronica, her husband Richard, and their ever-present assistant Pam. Eleanor told us that while the board members were technically given updates on spending, those reports were vague to the point of useless. There were no itemized breakdowns, no source documents, no transparency. When she, in her role as treasurer, formally demanded access to the original financial records to conduct a standard audit, the first response was veiled, polite, but unmistakable. Don't make things unnecessarily complicated. When she didn't back off, the pressure turned hostile. She was iced out, criticized, undermined, until eventually she stepped down. Luckily for us, Eleanor was also meticulous. She had quietly kept copies of her notes, plus a handful of financial documents she'd managed to retrieve before leaving. Among them were several invoices, all linked to Phoenix Development Group, and the figures were staggering. The so-called consulting services had been billed in amounts so large it defied belief. The scope of it was no longer just unethical, it was potentially criminal. With each passing day, our loose alliance of skeptics, survivors, and accidental investigators continued to grow. More residents came forward, more stories were told. And each account, each photocopied document added to the increasingly detailed portrait of something rotten hiding behind the HOA's manicured exterior. That small black flash drive, the one I'd found by pure chance in my garage, had ignited a fuse. It became the catalyst for everything that followed, the seed of a movement. And as I watched it unfold, I realized something important. This wasn't just about reclaiming my own peace, my land, my garage. Somewhere along the way, I had become the center of something far bigger, a battle against a rigged system built on coercion, deception, and greed. Veronica wasn't a fool, far from it. She had a predatory instinct, the kind of sixth sense that warned her when control was slipping, and she clearly picked up on the fact that I hadn't backed down. I wasn't retreating. If anything, I was gaining momentum. So, she turned up the heat. The intimidation campaign escalated quickly. Anonymous notes began appearing, slid under my door or dropped into my mailbox. They were vague in wording but clear in intention. I should stop digging into matters that didn't concern me and think hard about the consequences. One morning, I walked out to find all 4 tires on my car slashed. Clean, deliberate cuts. Then came the smear campaign. In the neighborhood's online discussion board, which previously hosted debates over bake sales and lost pets, posts began to surface, painting me as a disruptive influence, a troublemaker, a drama seeker, the kind of person who didn't respect community harmony. They were obviously planted, probably written by Pam or one of Veronica's loyalists, but their purpose was clear: isolate me, discredit me. But it was too late for fear tactics. I had seen too much, and more importantly, I wasn't alone. I had Claire, Gary, Eleanor, and now a growing coalition of residents who were ready to fight back. We weren't acting impulsively. We were building a case, quietly, carefully, preparing to strike in a way that couldn't be ignored. After months of collecting records, screenshots, witness accounts, and financial documents, Claire looked across my kitchen table with a hard, focused stare and said, "I think we've got enough." She didn't want to go straight to law enforcement. Not yet. She explained that the legal process could drag on for years, especially with Richard's network of legal connections muddying the water. If we handed everything over too early, there was a good chance it would all be buried or delayed beyond usefulness. No. Her idea was bolder. She suggested we expose it all publicly, in a place where Veronica thought she reigned supreme, an HOA General Assembly. And to make sure the story couldn't be brushed aside, Claire recommended inviting local press and a representative from the city council. Public pressure, she said, is stronger than paperwork right now. I found out that according to HOA bylaws, an emergency meeting could be called if at least 25 residents signed a request. With Eleanor's help, and the support of several homeowners who were now fed up and ready to speak, gathering signatures wasn't as difficult as I feared. The mood in the neighborhood had shifted. People were tired, and they wanted answers. We scheduled the meeting for 2 weeks later, giving us enough time to organize and prepare all the materials. Claire took charge of official outreach, sending an invitation to Miss Davis, the city councilwoman for our district, who had already received some troubling complaints about Golden Hills. She also reached out to a handful of well-respected local journalists, reporters who specialized in exposing shady dealings in small-town governments and homeowners associations. The fuse was lit. Now all we had to do was bring everything to light and make sure no one could look away. When word got back to Veronica that an emergency meeting had been successfully called by what she allegedly referred to as a gang of agitators, according to someone close to the board, she lost it. Furious, she immediately tried to shut it down. She claimed the petition was invalid, the process flawed, and the timing inappropriate. But Claire had anticipated every loophole. Every form was filed to the letter, every rule followed. Veronica's attempt to derail it fell flat, so she pivoted. Unable to cancel the meeting, Veronica decided to seize control of it instead. Her plan was simple: spin the whole thing as a malicious attack, discredit us publicly, and use the stage to reassert her dominance. She didn't want to survive the meeting. She wanted to crush us in front of everyone. I could feel the pressure mounting as the evening drew near. My stomach twisted with equal parts dread and resolve. This was it, the confrontation we had been preparing for. That night, the HOA clubhouse was more crowded than I had ever seen it. Every seat was taken. People stood along the walls, whispering in low voices. The atmosphere was electric, thick with anticipation. You could feel it in your throat, the quiet before something big. Veronica sat at the head table, stiff and tense despite her calm facade. Richard stared at the floor, silent. Pam hovered nearby, rifling papers. In the front row, Miss Davis from the city council took notes, flanked by two sharp-eyed local journalists. The meeting began with one of our own, a respected elder in the community who had helped organize the petition, stepping up to speak. His voice was steady as he laid out the reason for the gathering. "There are serious concerns," he said plainly, "regarding the financial practices and governance of the current HOA board, particularly those of its president, Mrs. Veronica Marshall." And then, it was my turn. They called my name, and I made my way to the podium. My hands were shaking slightly, but I forced myself to breathe. As soon as I began speaking, something changed. My voice steadied. It sounded stronger than I expected. I told them everything, from the day I bought my home and was immediately targeted, to the raptors in my garage, to the bogus violation notices, to the morning I found strangers ripping up my fruit trees. As I spoke, I played video clips and displayed photos on a screen we had brought in, the extension cord, the notices, the hidden camera footage, the documents. Each image landed like a silent punch in the room. The audience grew still, stunned by the story unfolding before them. Whispers rippled through the crowd, gasps audible at certain moments. But no one interrupted. I ended by reminding them that my story was just one thread in a much larger fabric, that I wasn't the only one Veronica had cornered, fined, or silenced, that what was happening wasn't about a single garage or a handful of trees. It was about a system of manipulation that had infected the entire community. And now, we were pulling the curtain back. Once I finished speaking, Claire stepped forward to take the floor. Unlike my emotional delivery, her tone was calm, precise, and razor-sharp, the voice of a seasoned attorney presenting airtight facts. She broke down the findings of our investigation with surgical clarity, building the case piece by piece. She began with Project_Phoenix and its ties to the HOA's internal finances. Then she exposed Richard Marshall's firm and the suspicious contracts that funneled HOA money into shell companies and offshore accounts. Screens showed payment records, company trails, and financial spreadsheets. Claire didn't stop there. She projected Gary's hidden camera photos showing the Marshalls siphoning electricity from the HOA clubhouse to power their private greenhouse. Then she unveiled her analysis of the Rose Festival budget over several years. Her findings were damning. Significant portions of the event's earnings had simply vanished into shadowy LLCs, while the recorded expenses had been clearly inflated to absurd levels. Finally, she read from a collection of anonymous but confirmed testimonies. Statements from real residents who had faced everything from verbal harassment to financial threats at Veronica's hands. These accounts painted a picture not just of mismanagement, but of systemic abuse. When Claire concluded her presentation, the room fell into an eerie silence. It was the kind of stillness that happens when a crowd knows they've just witnessed something undeniable. Veronica sat frozen at the front, her complexion pale and drawn, clinging to what little composure she had left. Her usual confident posture had given way to clenched fists and rigid shoulders. Richard, seated beside her, looked visibly shaken, beads of sweat on his forehead, dabbing at them nervously with a folded handkerchief. Then, as if something inside her snapped, Veronica shot up from her chair. Her voice, shrill and shaking, pierced the quiet. "This is slander!" she shrieked. "Lies! Baseless attacks driven by personal grudges." She jabbed a finger in my direction and shouted that I was on a mission to destroy her reputation and the reputation of the entire HOA board, all because of some personal vendetta. She demanded the meeting be ended immediately. "This farce has gone on long enough," she cried. But the room wasn't on her side anymore. But then something happened that Veronica clearly hadn't anticipated. Miss Davis, the city council representative, calmly but firmly cut in. She addressed Veronica directly and asked her to please sit down and allow other voices to be heard. There was no anger in her tone, just quiet authority, the kind that can't be ignored. Veronica hesitated, but with dozens of eyes on her, she sat. The mood shifted. Residents who had stayed quiet now spoke up, asking sharp questions about missing funds, unapproved expenses, and vague consulting deals. Veronica faltered. Her answers were scattered, defensive, and full of excuses about paperwork and confidentiality, but no one was buying it anymore. Then came the moment no one would forget. Gary stood up, laptop in hand, and walked to the projector. He didn't say much at first, just that he wanted to show the community something important. A still image appeared on the screen. It was footage from his security camera, time-stamped just 2 nights earlier. The scene was unmistakable. There was Richard Marshall, under cover of darkness, dragging several cardboard boxes and what looked like hard drives behind the HOA clubhouse. He was placing them into the dumpster, hurriedly, nervously. Then Gary, from the podium, held up what remained, scorched folders, partially melted electronic components, the very items retrieved from that dumpster the following morning. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Gary looked directly at Richard. "Were you trying to destroy evidence?" he asked flatly. Richard shot up, flustered, muttering something vague about old files and cleaning up junk. But before anyone could process that, one of the journalists stood and addressed him bluntly. "Mr. Marshall," she said, "would you care to comment on allegations that your firm, Marshall & Associates, has received over $500,000 in vaguely described contracts from the Golden Hills HOA in the past 3 years?" Silence. Richard turned ghostly pale. Then, slowly, he sank back into his chair like the air had been knocked from his lungs. He didn't speak again. Veronica stared at him, stunned, her expression a mixture of disbelief, fury, and something close to panic. The rest happened swiftly. One by one, the HOA members cast their votes. The result was nearly unanimous. Veronica Marshall was removed from her position as president, effective immediately. The entire sitting board was dismissed. A motion passed to initiate a full, independent financial audit of the HOA's operations covering the last 5 years, to be conducted by a neutral outside firm. Until a new board could be democratically elected, a temporary committee would be formed, led by trusted residents. Eleanor Weinberg and Gary were both nominated without objection. And most importantly, for me and for every border homeowner who had lived under Veronica's shadow, it was formally declared, with documentation, that our properties had never been and would never be under the jurisdiction of Golden Hills Estates. For the first time in a long time, I exhaled, truly exhaled, and felt the weight begin to lift. Miss Davis stepped forward to deliver a closing statement. Her tone was measured, but you could feel the weight of what had just unfolded. She said the city council was deeply alarmed by everything that had come to light during the meeting. As a result, she announced, an official municipal inquiry into the operations of the Golden Hills Estates HOA would be launched immediately. She added that all the evidence shared that evening, along with the forthcoming results of the independent audit, would be forwarded to the county prosecutor's office and other appropriate legal authorities for further investigation. Furthermore, she confirmed that allegations concerning potential breaches of real estate law by Veronica Marshall would be referred to the State Real Estate Commission for disciplinary review. Veronica and Richard stood to leave, visibly shaken. Silence gave way to angry shouts. Formerly intimidated neighbors now watched them with contempt. Their empire of lies collapsed in one unforgettable night. For me, and for many others in Green Valley, this was more than a personal win. It was the end of a long, exhausting battle, and that made the victory even sweeter. We had fought back, and we had won. The fallout came quickly. A court froze the marshals' assets before they could hide funds. Veronica had to repay the HOA, lost her real estate license, paid a fine, and got community service. Richard was disbarred, fined, and held liable. Pam received probation for her role. The names and data found on that flash drive, especially the ones labeled as guests, were handed over to federal agencies. What happened next was beyond our reach, but one thing was certain. Those names were no longer safe in the shadows. A new chapter began for Golden Hills Estates. Gary was elected interim president and immediately pushed for transparency, fairness, and proper oversight. Community meetings became open and inclusive. Fences were mended, both literally and figuratively. As for me, I finally exhaled. I decided to join the HOA, not because I had to, but because I now trusted the people in charge. Respect had replaced fear, and justice after all the chaos had prevailed.